Bene, mi sentite già tutti, il microfono funziona, magnifico. Allora, buongiorno a tutti e ben arrivati a questo evento che parte da una collaborazione fra il Locarno Film Festival e l'Agenzia ONU per i Rifugiati. L'occasione è data, lo sapete, dai 70 anni della Convenzione ONU sui rifugiati ed è naturalmente un grandissimo piacere poter parlare di questo tema che è così importante perché ci coinvolge tutti, insomma, coinvolge i valori dell'umanità e concerne milioni, anzi decine di milioni di persone in tutto il mondo. E insomma, dicevo, è un grandissimo piacere poterne parlare con Gillian Triggs, che è assistente alto commissario per la protezione dell'Agenzia ONU sui rifugiati. So, thank you very much, Mrs. Triggs, being here with us for this conversation on such an important topic. We would like with you to have a global picture on this phenomenon. Io dico soltanto ancora una cosa, che avete assicurata la traduzione francese-inglese, quindi ecco, da questo punto di vista non vi dovete assolutamente preoccupare, la signora Triggs parlerà in inglese, ma è assolutamente tradotto. So, let's go in medias res. We know, everybody knows that in the last 1.5 years we had one big emergency, which was the pandemic one. But of course, this other crisis, the refugee crisis, didn't disappear. So I ask you as first question, which is the situation now on this point of view?
Well, firstly, thank you very much. I'm really honoured to be interviewed
I'm
by you
honoured.
to have a conversation. And thank you all for being here. I do apologize that I do not speak that beautiful language, Italian, but I hope that you can understand my English, but thank you. Yes, to answer your question, we, at the United Nations Refugee Agency, we are really concerned. These are unprecedented times, and we have, in a way, three crises. The crisis of COVID, the crisis for protection of people forcibly displaced, and the crisis of climate change. And all of them are now impacting, in particular, on people who've been forcibly displaced from their homes. So if I could just give you an example of the numbers, that we're here in part, and so pleased to be here to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. And when it was negotiated here in Switzerland, the convention was born here in Switzerland, there were, of course, many people still displaced at the end of the Second World War. But today, we've reported 82 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. 26 million or so are refugees. So we have never had numbers of this kind before. And that is why it's so important to be able to work with the artistic community and the film industry, the actors, the writers, the journalists, to really give a human face.
Yes, and we will tell about its importance at the end of our conversations. But you are telling just now that the numbers of refugees are even rising despite COVID. So why?
Yes, it's true. We had rather hoped that with COVID that would settle things down. People would not be moving. But in fact, the numbers have gone up. They've gone up by 4% in this last year, so that's continued. But so you asked the question why, and there are many reasons, many root causes for people being displaced, but overwhelmingly the most important of them is conflict, as violence. And you're all very familiar, of course, with conflict in Afghanistan. We're now moving into the 5th decade of the conflict in Afghanistan, and it's getting worse as we speak. But we also have Syria now, 11 years of the loss of people from Syria. But we've also got new conflicts in this last year. Ethiopia, that we were very proud of in UNHCR. We felt that the new president was managing the ethnic tensions, that he was building a new country. Of course, he got the Nobel Peace Prize last year, and we felt that Ethiopia was an opportunity in Africa to show how communities could work together. But now, of course, we're seeing one of the worst insurgencies in Tigray, and the horrific killing of people and displacement. Then we have Mozambique, which of course has erupted unexpectedly with nearly 1 million people displaced from Cabo Delgado into the southern parts of Mozambique. We have continued displacement of people, partly linked to climate change, but that when crops fail, when there's no land to graze your cattle on, that leads to no access to water. Then you get intertribal or intercommunal conflict, and that leads to extreme violence. So the short answer to your question is very high numbers of violent conflict across the world, and the inability really to find peace, and that's where we need leadership for peace.
Leadership for peace, and that's also a topic that we will face after. But you said, of course, the violence and the wars in the world, but also climate change, and that's a very important topic. And just this morning, the scientists of the United Nations said that it's code red for humanity. So it's becoming worse. And do you expect so this kind of refugees becoming a rising number in the next years?
We do. And of course, the Refugee Convention itself was never really designed for something like people being displaced because of flooding and natural disasters. But increasingly, lives are at risk with catastrophic flooding and climate change. We have the fires now in Greece, in California, and of course in my home country in Australia we're very used to fires, but now they are of a scale and proportion globally that we've not seen before. So we of course have the news this morning that they are now talking about not climate change, but climate chaos and a climate crisis. It is now, the scientific evidence is now really incontrovertible. You cannot argue against it. So that is leading to people, it's leading to communal violence, it's leading to increased poverty, and that is where we're starting to see numbers of people leaving. Of course, a particular example is people leaving the Pacific Islands with sea rise.
Yes.
And they are looking for, because they can't grow their crops, they can't manage their very simple lives, and so they're leaving for other major countries to find a new home. And I think eventually the jurisprudence and the law will catch up with that.
And we saw this summer also the floods, the dramatic floods in Germany, and this means that also Europe is now concerned with this kind of problem.
Well, exactly. No country is untouchable, and it can be different. It can be the Sahel in Africa, where there's no arable land, no land for transitory cattle, but we can see it in fires in California, the flooding that brought so much damage in Germany, and I think I still don't know the facts really of how many people died in those floods, but it was shocking, the number of people who died. And then we have rising sea levels in Bangladesh and in all the delta areas, all rising, people losing access to land and having to find somewhere else to go. So I think it is an enormous global challenge, and one that I think we're all now starting to understand a little better.
You said before that one of the most important reasons for refugees to flee their homes is, of course, war and violence. And in Afghanistan, we know the situation is getting worse. Taliban are back, and people fear now the return of the civil war. So, do you expect much more people fleeing from Afghanistan in the next next weeks?
Well, that's of course a very important question. We know that many millions of Afghanis have fled over these last 50 years, but particularly over the last 10 years or so, and they've fled all over the world. They've gone to Pakistan and Iran, but they've come to many countries, and I know to Italy and to Switzerland and parts of Europe. We don't yet know what is happening. I mean, of course, the Taliban are now taking over increased parts of the country. But the Taliban has also been working very successfully with towns and villages. And at the moment, we've seen some displacement within Afghanistan itself, but we haven't yet seen large numbers moving across boundaries, moving across to other countries. Some are, but the numbers have been quite small. But at the UN Refugee Agency, we of course have contingency planning, and we are planning for numbers to leave. And we will be working with other countries to see if we can find places of safety. But probably the bigger problem at the moment is internal displacement. Yes. They're trying to stay within their own country. But it may be, as the news gets worse, that we'll see people leaving.
And you are observing in a particular way this kind of problem now in Afghanistan?
We are, and we have, the UNHCR is of course an emergency organization. We provide humanitarian protection and help for people fleeing in an emergency, but we hope to work within the country, but we are planning to work outside.
Mrs. Triggs, should now countries suspend deportations of Afghan people to this country, to Afghanistan? I ask you because also Switzerland is now under pressure. Yes. Because it's still proceeding in this way.
That's right. Well, perhaps I could begin by saying that if you are a refugee, you can never be returned to a place of danger, of violence or persecution at risk to your life. That is one of the, we're here to, at the Locarno Film Festival to celebrate 70 years of the convention, and that is one of the key fundamental provisions. Nobody may ever be returned to a place of danger. But of course some people come and they are not entitled to refugee status. They're not refugees. They are migrants. I don't blame them for seeking a better life, but they are not refugees. And a government, a sovereign government, is entitled to send that person back if they are not a refugee. But the difficulty is that some countries are actually sending back people who are refugees and entitled to refugee protection. So we very strongly urge governments across the world, if they are a refugee, exercise extreme caution before you ever return people to where they might be in danger. And of course, in Afghanistan, it is a highly unstable and dangerous environment for many people.
Yes.
So we do urge any government that's thinking of sending people back that they assess whether it's safe enough to do that. For example, at the UN Refugee Agency, we are very clear that Syria is not a safe country and no one may be returned as a refugee looking for international protection to that country. Now, we're not usually overly categorical, but we feel very strongly about this in the context of Syria. With regard to Afghanistan, we are still assessing the facts. We want to work well with the government. We want to support the people in their villages. But in the end, it may be too dangerous to send people back.
So Syria, and which are the other countries you don't consider safe?
Well, at the moment, Syria is the main, but another is Libya. As you may know, many people come through Libya to the Mediterranean to seek asylum in Europe. And people are being, depending on your point of view, rescued or stopped at sea, and then they are being taken back to reception centres and detention facilities in Libya, where the conditions are very poor indeed. And we, again, say that people must have that is the point of the Refugee Convention. If they're fleeing from violence and danger and persecution, they must be free to move to seek protection elsewhere. And when they are being stopped and taken back to dangerous environments, we urge governments to abide by the convention. So Libya would be another example.
You just mentioned these very dramatic and dangerous trips by sea from refugees towards Europe. We see those pictures every day in a newspaper, on TV. And so why do these people accept to face those difficulties and this danger, even if they know that it's a risk of their lives? How much courage does it take to face such a trip?
Well, that's of course the question so many people want to know. Why would a family with young children get into these dangerous boats at the mercy of people smugglers? They pay whatever money they can manage to find from their families, and they know that the risk of drowning is very high, and that they will be stopped. They will be picked up by the Libyan Coast Guard or other coast guards and taken back to the same place of danger, and very often incarcerated effectively in prisons in very, very bad conditions. Why would they do it? The answer lies in the fact that they are desperate. They're absolutely desperate. They see no possibility of surviving if they continue in the environment in which they live. So let us take the Rohingya, the Muslim Rohingyan people of Myanmar. 1 million have left Myanmar, where it's under a military dictatorship. We've seen the coup in September, but they've been leaving in very large numbers because their children are not entitled to citizenship. The Rohingya have no citizenship. They have very few rights, and they are being literally burned out of their villages. The women are being raped. The children cannot have education, and they've fled to another quite poor and developing country in Bangladesh. And there are about 850,000 of them in Cox's Bazar. I was there recently with my colleagues from the UN Refugee Agency to see the conditions there. The Bangladeshi government is providing protection as best they can, but they're not a wealthy country. And they've had 1 million people there now for the last 4 or 5 years, last 4 years. But again, why would you be leaving your village in Rakhine State? You have something of a life there. You can practice your religion, but you're being literally, the military forcing you out, and they have no other solution but to pay people smugglers to find any route out. And one could look at the Sahel, where many people from that middle part of Africa, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, they have no future. Particularly young men. They have phones. They can see how we live in Locarno.
Yes, of course.
They can see the food we eat, the education that we have, the health facilities.
And they dream of it.
It's no wonder that they're saying we cannot live in this violence and persecution. We're discriminated against. We have armed groups, extremist armed groups, literally attacking them. In the end, they say we must find another life. And so they take dangerous journeys. They're at the risk of people smugglers, of traffickers. They are sexually exploited and abused. But they'll do anything, to come back to your question, they'll do anything to get into these boats and across the Mediterranean.
The courage of desperation.
Indeed, and they are courageous, and they have hope. But that hope is dashed so often. And in fact, as we speak, or when I last checked my emails, there are 800 people have been rescued by some NGOs, non-government organizations. They're floating around the Mediterranean, but no country will allow them to disembark. Now, eventually, a country will allow them to disembark. Usually they do. Italy has been very generous. But some from Bangladeshis, for example, from Bangladesh rather, usually Rohingya, a boat was at sea for 9 months with many people on the boat dying, and they were finally accepted by Aceh, which is a province of Indonesia, which respected their religious rights and gave them a disembarkation. But this is happening every week. We see these news items coming through. They're truly, truly shocking. But also, there are positive stories. We have NGO groups funding boats in the Mediterranean to pick people up and to try to find a place for them. So we have some of the most inspiring stories, but we also have some of the most despairing.
And dramatic stories. Yeah, you said before they pay sometimes a lot of money to try to reach the European coast, and this is another dramatic and also criminal aspect which concerns human traffickers. I ask you, is it a lost battle? Because I read that this kind of industry of human beings is worth $6 billion, 6 miliardi di dollari, and it's the third illegal industry of the world after weapons and drugs. Mrs. Triggs, is it a lost battle or not?
Well, I'm an optimist, which is why I'm in this job. So I will always tend to say that we have to keep struggling, but the trafficking in people is a huge global industry, and it's a very, very tragic one. But maybe I could just remind us a little bit of the history, that when the Jews and political oppositions were trying to escape from Poland and from Germany and during the Second World War, they paid for people smugglers. They paid traffickers, effectively. They paid people to help them get out, to get passports, to get transport. Now, these people were helping. Unfortunately, of course, many of the people smugglers that we're dealing with today are people who are essentially in a business. They are trafficking in human beings for large sums of money. Families are being forced to find money from any source to telegraph it, to transport it and allow these people to travel. So it's reached a very high level of urgency in Europe, especially the European Commission, the European ministers are attempting to deal with it. But we have to defeat the people smugglers as well as giving people an opportunity to make a claim for asylum. And there's a tension there and a conflict.
I started seeing that in the last 1.5 years we had only one big emergency, which was the pandemic one. May I ask you something about the sanitary conditions in refugee camps?
Well, when the pandemic began, we were really very, very worried, terrified, in fact, that because in refugee camps people are in very close quarters. As I say, I've just been to Cox's Bazar. People are crammed into tiny tents, and we thought COVID would spread like wildfire. Yes. We were very, very worried indeed. But the truth is that because they're relatively isolated from the rest of communities, the numbers of refugees with COVID is quite small. Now, I should, of course, make the point that most refugees these days are not in camps. They're in urban areas or provincial cities. And so there, the numbers, of course, were as high as the general community. But it has been an astonishing fact that where we have camps, in Africa, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, other parts of Latin America, the numbers have been quite small. So that is a mercy.
And what about the vaccination campaign in these refugee camps?
Well, that's been a very mixed picture. As you know, the World Health Organization says if one person is unsafe, we're all unsafe. Everybody, it's a global phenomenon.
Yes.
It's obvious to us all. So you can't say, well, you're stateless, or you're a refugee, or you're a criminal. We're not going to vaccinate you. It makes no common sense at all. So common sense has prevailed in many countries. But some countries have very few vaccines. So they've been inclined to say, as you would probably as a political leader, I must vaccinate my own people before I vaccinate others. So it's a very mixed picture. But the most shocking picture, and I'm sure you've all seen these graphs on the news, but you see vaccinations going up in Europe, the numbers of vaccinations becoming available, and we're getting to 50, 60, 70%. And along the bottom of the graph is Africa, with 1 or 2% of people vaccinated. Now, that is slowly changing. There's a big international program run through Geneva, through the United Nations, for vaccines to be donated, and those vaccines are then going to some of the poorest countries.
It's the COVAX program.
The COVAX program. Yes. And that is, again, so when I tell a very tragic story, we also tell very positive ones. Yes. That this is a donation scheme. Wealthier countries are giving their vaccines, and they are slowly coming into poorer countries, but it's a problem.
And what do you think when you feel, how you feel when you hear that in the rich countries it happens sometimes that they have to throw away the vaccine because they are expired?
Well, that is deeply troubling, and we can do better than that. I mean, we can do things faster. We can plan. We don't need to have this waste. So we can do remarkable things scientifically. We can achieve such great things as human beings. I know that we could manage this if we properly fund the World Health Organization. We work with our medical profession across the world. We can deliver these vaccines, and we can give people vaccinations. But it's been slow, and it's been disappointing. I'd have to say it's been very disappointing.
Mrs. Triggs, do you think that during the pandemic, which has caused also an economical crisis, the attitude towards migrants and refugees has changed? The borders closed, we went in our homes. Did something happen in this way?
Well, it has. And I think in the initial stages, I think we had to understand that we were all frightened of COVID. So governments did what all sovereign governments do. They closed their borders. So at the height of the pandemic last year, 168 countries closed their borders. And at that time, about 100 made no exception for refugees or people in need of protection. Now that situation has improved. Countries are now using technology to enable claims to asylum to be made. They are trying to protect people at their borders who are seeking protection. But there's no doubt at all that the impact of COVID has been very high. But the other point that I think your question really goes to is that the pandemic has led to great economic hardship for all vulnerable people across the world. And unfortunately, vulnerable people, by definition, include, of course, refugees and asylum seekers, but they're the ones who often work in the informal economy. They don't have an employer who will continue to pay them. They can't work at home. They don't have that kind of job. So in the tourist industry, travel, all the casual work that many of us in the economy depend on, these people are first to lose their jobs, first to lose access to any funding. And of course, refugees fall into that category. The other is that often refugees are stateless, they have no documentation, they've fled violence, they haven't time to pick up their documentation, and they often don't have documentation at all. So that when they go to a local clinic to get health care, they will be denied that health care. Now again, many countries have said, no, we will make sure you have health care. We'll make sure we give you documentation and we look after you. But unfortunately, there's that very vulnerable bottom layer of society which is vulnerable. So I think societies have been very worried about people who are not in the system. Mm-hmm. They see them as taking jobs sometimes.
That's why I ask you.
Yes.
What do you answer when people have this kind of fear? They are taking away our opportunities, our jobs.
That's
what
right.
do you answer?
Well, the answer is that we care for the host communities equally with our refugees. The High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, is very clear that we do not protect asylum seekers and refugees at the cost of local communities. We try to work with them. But the better answer to that question is refugees and asylum seekers bring so much richness
Of course.
to the culture. And the first night that we were here, on Saturday night, I was waiting for the film to start, that wonderful movie, Monte Verita, which I must go to Monte Verita. It was remarkable. But somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm with the UN Refugee Agency." And they said, "Well, I'm a refugee from Syria, and I came to Europe to seek protection. I was cared for in Europe, and I'm now in America. I have American citizenship, but I'm an actor, and I'm in one of the films that's being launched here at the Locarno Film Festival." And for me, that is really what a refugee can bring. They want to work. They're artists. They bring professional skills. They bring education. But above all else, I think they bring a great spirit of motivation and courage, as you've said.
No,
and
right.
I think we should respect that.
You're right. We must consider the richness that refugees bring us. But yesterday I read in the Swiss newspaper an interview on former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, I'm sorry, who said about the welcoming of 1 million refugees in Germany 2015. Attention not to create a competition between those who arrive and the people who already live here.
That's right.
So do you agree? Is it important to care about this problem?
Well, we have to anticipate it. We have to be prepared for it. But I think he's absolutely right. And Germany, of course, has been a wonderful leader, as has Switzerland. Switzerland has supported refugees for hundreds of years. Those of you know, in the Geneva, in the main shopping centre in Geneva, is a wonderful monument to protection for the Protestant refugees at that time, and it's been a great tradition. So yes, it's not about competition. It's about compassion to other human beings. And to assist them as best we can, but also to include them in society so that they then contribute their own skills to that environment. And we all know that we're now very intermixed in our countries. The country I come from is a migrant country, many from Italy, many from Europe, and they've transformed Australia. The richness they bring, many of them refugees from the war, others refugees from Africa, from Latin America. And every time the new wave of refugees come, they enrich that society. And I think that's the case for Germany, and it's going to be the case for Europe. So at the UN Refugee Agency, we are very, very grateful to the support we get from Europe, and of course Switzerland, which hosts us in Geneva.
But migration is always a political argument, and it always flows in political campaign. I ask you, how much do the profiles of world leaders matter in establishing a climate of understanding and acceptance of migration and refugees?
Well, thank you for that question, because I have come in my own professional life now to see how vital leadership is. Mm-hmm. Leadership in every facet of society, whether it's somebody leading the film festival, somebody leading a social civil society group, but our federal, our political systems are absolutely vital. If you have a leader like Angela Merkel in Germany, I will mention her because she's special.
I know you admire her very much.
That's right. But when you have a leader like that, and leaders, of course, in the Confederation here in Switzerland, then that sets the tone for the whole country. Mm-hmm. It means that you can courageously stand up yourself and say in your small village, yes, we stand up for this. We can be generous-spirited. We have to manage it, but we can do it. And I think when you see a leader, a political leader, standing up for refugees, then that creates an environment where everybody says, right, well, we can do this. So that we've seen, of course, the huge change in the United States with the Biden administration now opening up to refugees and trying to take children on the Mexican border who are unaccompanied. It's a very, very difficult political situation, very dangerous for a political leader sometimes. But we need leaders with political courage globally. And when you see them acting courageously and in a humane way, I think they command our respect.
You said a leader who is able to say, we can do that, wir schaffen das. These were the famous words of Angela Merkel. Do you think Europe will miss a leader like Angela Merkel?
I think they will. I mean, she's been a wonderful leader of her own country, but she's actually been a leader globally. And of course, a wonderful role model for women to show that
yes.
She could stand for what she believes in. And she's been courageous, and she's done it with political consequences. But she's stood by her principles, and I think she will go down in history as one of the great 20th and 21st century leaders.
And she did a lot for human rights.
She does. She believes in human rights. And but she's also, of course, very good in terms of leading on trade and economy and the whole range of things. But she has a very deep commitment to human rights. From her own background, I think she understands those needs and supports them.
You said how important it is also that in the White House there is now Joe Biden. So the return also of multilateralism, that's essential for this kind of battle.
Well, that's true, and we see that, of course, in Geneva, because so many of the United Nations bodies are there, the World Trade Organization is there. So it's very inspiring, of course, to live in Geneva and see this. But, of course, we need it in New York, a return to multilateralism. That we, in a way, COVID has, of course, it's brought the deaths of millions of people. I think close to 4.5 million people have died. So it's been a great global tragedy. But it's also brought some positive things. And one is that we can't manage global challenges like climate change or a health pandemic. We can't manage it alone. You can't do it with a bilateral arrangement or even a regional arrangement. We have to work together. Now, it's difficult. You know, we talk a lot in the UN, but talking's got to be better than fighting. We will get there. We can do it. But you're bringing 193 countries together is hard. But I think it's a vision that was born, of course, here on the shore of Lake Geneva with the covenant of the League of Nations, and then, of course, the United Nations from Dumbarton Oaks in the United States. But that vision is being carried on in Europe, and I think we need to keep working at it.
Mrs. Triggs, that's also the reason why we are here today. The United Nations Refugee Convention is 70 years old, and can you tell us once again what it really stipulates?
Well, the Refugee Convention, in just a phrase, the Refugee Convention has saved millions of lives in the last 70 years. It has two core principles, legal principles, that underpin all our work. One, everybody in the world has a right to claim asylum and to be protected. Now, not everybody will get refugee status, but those who are fleeing from conflict and persecution have a right to make that claim and to show that they have that right. The other principle is the one that I've mentioned. No one may ever be returned as a refugee to danger and to persecution. They're two very simple ideas, and the document is an easy read. It's in plain English, and I'm sure it can be plain German and plain French and plain Italian. So it's not a difficult document. It's a small document. It has protected lives because pretty well every nation in the world respects the Refugee Convention, in principle. They will always commit to those principles. In fact, of course, not all nations do. And so we find in many parts of the world boats being pushed back, people being pushed back at the borders, people being returned to unsafe environments. But if we speak to the ministers, to the government, they will always say to us at the UNHCR, yes, we abide by those principles. So it's not a perfect world, a long way from perfect. But I think I see it when I go on mission to various countries over the last few months, that compliance with the recognition of refugees and giving them protection saves millions and millions of lives over many decades. So it's not a perfect agreement. It's not perfectly respected. But I think we have to continue to support it. And that's why it's been so important to come to the Locarno Film Festival, where you very generously agreed to respect the convention.
Mrs. Triggs, we may now almost conclude our conversation, so it's also time for you to make some questions if you like. We are in the Film Festival of Locarno, which is the most important in Switzerland and one of the most important in Europe. And I ask you, what's the importance of cinema and culture also on this argument, also to spread an idea of refugees, migrations, and to put a spotlight on these arguments?
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm a lawyer and I love to talk about the law. I love to talk about the numbers and so on, but it doesn't have much political impact. What has an impact is telling the story. So I can talk about 82 million people, doesn't have much impact. But a filmmaker, an actor, a writer, an artist can tell the story of one person, and that can move the minds and hearts of millions of people. So at the UN Refugee Agency, we greatly respect the filmmakers who can tell that story so movingly and so convincingly. And somebody who's seen the movies, they've seen a child suffer with no education. They've seen a grandmother caring for her grandchildren when the parents have been killed. You tell those individual stories. An artist can move hearts as well as minds, and that makes our job easier. And that's why it's very unusual for us to be invited to a film festival, and that's why we're very pleased to be here.
Which are the films that you prefer on this on this kind of matter?
Well, of course, films can be very controversial, and if I pick one, I'll find somebody who says, no, that's not a good one. But the one that I love to mention is, of course, Casablanca. We all remember Casablanca, and that was really about finding a safe place to counter a totalitarian or fascist government. So that's my favorite. I can keep watching that one. But there are many, many, many other films by historical films, but as well as artists today producing these wonderful films. One I can mention is a Chinese director, Ai Weiwei, who's done one called The Human Flow. But there are hundreds and hundreds of these films.
You said filmmakers, of course, are able to tell stories in the films, in the movies, but you also met a lot of personal, individual stories yes. Which probably touched Indeed. You very, very much. Could you tell something about it?
Well, there's one that I love to mention. Well, two. One's a sad story, and the other is a much more positive story. But you never forget the individuals wherever you go. But coming from Australia, of course, in my former job, I went to Christmas Island, which is about 4 hours flight from Perth, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And sadly, people who've sought protection are picked up and taken to this very isolated island. And I would go to that island quite frequently to make sure that they were okay, to try to represent them, and to make sure that they were properly protected. But I met a young girl there. She was 12 years old, and she'd come from South Sudan. And her parents had been killed in front of her eyes. Her brothers and sisters had been murdered. But she managed to escape, and an aunt who had a little bit of cash paid people smugglers to get her out of South Sudan and ultimately through Indonesia to the Indian Ocean, where she was finally picked up. And when I talked to her, she told me the story of how her father was killed and her mother was killed and her brothers and her sisters and all of the things that had happened to her, and the voyage where she was frightened of the sharks and frightened of the sea life. But she was quite calm. And then she said to me, I've been on Christmas Island for more than a year, completely on my own, nobody to really care for her. And then she burst into tears and said, I've had no education for a year, and without education, I have no future. And I remember thinking that even a young girl, she can survive these horrible things that happened to her, but she understood that if she didn't have education, she had no future. She had nothing, she could never be hopeful that she could do something with her life. And when she was in tears, I was in tears, and I left, and I had to get on a plane and go back to Australia, where there was nothing I could do for her. So that was a very sad story, and I hope she got off the island and ultimately got to school. But I think we can never forget that young people know when they're being maltreated. They know when they're being discriminated against or where they're being denied the opportunities in life. But the other was a much more positive story. I was on another island where, again, people were sadly being kept detained for years and years. And I met a young girl, this time from South Sudan. She was 17 years old, and she was, the wonderful bright coloured clothes they wear, wonderful coloured skirts and a big coloured turban, and she was just learning to speak English. And I said, what do you want to do when you get off this island? And she said, I want to be a poet in English. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, I'm not sure you're going to, no, I don't know how you're going to become a poet in another language. Well, she finally was released from the island, and she rang me 2 years later and said she's written a book of poetry, and would I launch the book of poetry for her, which I did. And it became a bestseller in Sydney in Australia. And she's now at university, and she will be a poet. So there's great inspiration and great possibilities, but also there's great cruelty. And I think that we have to stand up for that cruelty. And that's why we come back to your point about leadership. I think and it doesn't matter how important you are or how politically powerful you are, if you lead in your own community, then I think that helps others understand the importance of a humanitarian response to these people who are trying to achieve peace and get on with their lives.
Yeah, this is a very strong and beautiful message. Mrs. Triggs, thanks so much at this moment. So I think it's time for you, if you want to make some questions. Alla signora Triggs, prego. Vi esprimete qui c'è qualcuno col microfono ambulante. Come detto, potete esprimervi in italiano o francese. La signora... you have the translation.
Oh, good.
I was speaking
so
English.
No problem.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucia Tramer. I'm speaking on behalf of the Geneva Support Group of Protection and Promotion of Human Rights in Western Sahara. The UNHCR considers the situation of the Sahrawi refugees as one of the long-standing ones. The geographical position of the camps make the living condition also one of the harder to support, and the occupying power of Western Sahara, the Kingdom of Morocco, takes every possible diplomatic and political action in order to weaken the international support to these refugees, including by underestimating the number of those refugees. Indeed, the accurate numbering of the refugees is an essential step for their protection. And in 2018, a study was carried out by your office in collaboration with other entities. I have here a copy. This report was first published on the UNICEF website, but then it disappeared and never was published by your office. Could you kindly explain me why this report has never been published on your website office? And in any case, could you envisage publishing it in order to ensure a better protection to the Sahrawi refugees? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for raising the plight of the Sahrawi people, because it has now been since the late 60s, early 70s that they have been fighting for their own for their rights under international law. So thank you, firstly, asking the question. Secondly, I'm not aware of that report, but I will go back with my colleagues. I go back to Geneva tonight, and I will ask about your report. What year was it what year was the study? 2018. All right. Well, I will give you my card when I leave, and I will find out about that report. I'm sure it must be in our system. I will find out about it and find. But beyond that report, and I certainly will find out what happened to it. But beyond that, the plight of these people is long-standing, and we try to work with the governments concerned, particularly with Morocco. But one point you make that I will perhaps elaborate a little on is making the registration for us to be able, all the country, but for us to be able to register people is a critical part of our job, because until we know who the people are, it's very hard for us to advocate for them. And if we're not allowed to register them, we can't. It's hard to advocate, and that is how some countries will try to prevent us from speaking out, because we can't register. So this is an issue, and we will. I know we are working hard on this, and we have meetings myself with the relevant ambassadors to discuss this problem. Of course, they are in many countries in North Africa, and we do try to deal with all of them. But maybe we could speak offline and know a little bit more about your work. And if you're in Geneva, I'm sure we should be able to talk a little more frequently. But thank you very much.
Bene. C'è un'altra signora che vuole fare una domanda?
No, creo che I think the yeah, okay, I go.
Sì, ma c'è spazio per tutti.
Yeah. My name is Ursula Hauser. I'm psychologist, and now inspired also by my colleague, I work with the NGO Medico International Switzerland, further Centre Sanitaire Suisse, since more than 20 years in Palestine, mostly in Gaza, as a psychologist. We want justice. We want, of course, trying to get out the people of this. There are for 70% of the people in Gaza live in refugee camps, as you might know. And since while the occupation forces are there, there will be more and more problems. So the link, of course, from human rights to politics is there, very complicated, no? But as a psychologist, my question is, if now the COVID gets together with the violence of living beyond occupation, the fear is multiplied, the traumatization also, and the vaccination doesn't enter easily. The COVID enters, doesn't know frontiers, but the vaccination is a political issue. And my question, or also my wish, is if you who make so wonderful work also in Palestine, but there must be more pressure, there must be more compassion to the Gazan people who are looked at as terrorists generally, and really the profound historical roots who are in Europe, a lot of the responsibility of the colonialists' time, make it so difficult to see what brutality is the checkpoints. And the vaccination cannot enter easily. Actually, 1 year ago, they were wasted. The time got out because they didn't let it in. Thank you so much, anyway, for your work.
Well, thank you. It's a tragedy, of course. As you say, COVID doesn't respect borders. It doesn't respect social and economic status. COVID is attacking all of us in different environments. And in the cramped and really despairing conditions in Gaza, one would imagine there's a much higher risk of contagion there than other places, but I don't actually know that, but I imagine. But of course it's critical that the vaccines get in. And as I say, most countries around the world do vaccinate their refugees and stateless people, simply because it's common sense, so you must do it. But if you you're describing a situation where the vaccines are not getting in, that is, of course, a despairingly disgraceful position. As you may know, UNHCR does not deal with the refugees in Gaza. Another UN body does, but nonetheless, your point is perfectly valid and one that we're very well aware of. I'm hoping that with the UN vaccine program, that they can get the vaccines in and increase the numbers. And I think that frankly, it's the only hope for all of us to get those vaccines done. And we cannot afford to have any. I mean, of course, some of the most impoverished and sad peoples on earth. Not to have the vaccine is disgraceful. But let's hope that the COVAX program will start to be effective. But of course, very close by is Jordan, where I was in Jordan recently, and the Jordanian government almost said to me, well, why are you asking the question? Of course we're giving vaccines to refugees. I mean, they didn't even see it as an issue. So, in a very similar part of the world, very close to each other, you have very different political responses, and unfortunately, vaccines do become political. And that's why I'm hoping that the UN program will help to resolve that.
So once again, the importance of COVAX program.
Yes.
I think there is another question. Please.
Yes. Well, my name is George Enderley. I thank you very much for your very interesting and informative presentations. My question is about the 1951 Refugee Convention. I studied quite a lot on the history of human rights, and I wonder how you see the connection between that convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was developed with Eleanor Roosevelt over 2 years, a very intensive international negotiation which came up with that consensus between the Soviet Union and Latin American countries and etc. So I wonder how the Refugee Convention came out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then other that's connected with your good example. You said that women thought education is so important, and we have, of course, also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to education. How is that connected in your work?
Well, firstly, of course, that was the inspiring document, the Declaration on Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt really spearheaded. She used her political power, her influence, her credibility, her humanity to bring all of these countries together. I think about 48 or 50 countries at that time. And she succeeded in getting people to agree to the rights that underpin the whole of the modern human rights legal world. The declaration, of course, was just a declaration. It wasn't legally binding. So it's easier, of course, to get people to agree to something which is not binding. But nonetheless, it was a huge achievement in 1948. But one of the articles of the Universal Declaration is the right of everyone to seek asylum. So there was the first idea. And then it was 3 more years before we got to not just a declaration, but a full-blown treaty with 26 countries. That was for Europe, and it was driven by the fact that 6 years after the Second World War, there was still about 2 million people displaced forcibly. Now, of course, there were many millions displaced during the war itself across the world, but they used the opportunity in Europe to get a treaty which picked up on the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but gave it legal form. And that's been the miracle of the Refugee Convention. It's probably the most successful human rights agreement ever. And 148 countries are party to it. And of course the protocol which followed in 1967. So it's been a remarkable achievement. Now, you've asked the more modern question. That was 1951. And perhaps I could say, by the way, that one of the things that led to its success was that it was so close to the catastrophe of the Second World War. So that when you have a global catastrophe, you have more political willingness to agree on this refugee convention. You could not achieve a convention like that today because we simply don't have the political will to do it. And that is another reason why we have to safeguard and respect the Refugee Convention. But since then, we've had the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Torture Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on Economic and Social Rights, the Convention on Women, the Convention on Disabilities, and then we had, of course, the creation of the International Criminal Court and international criminal law, all developing, but picking up on the core ideas of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Eleanor Roosevelt. So it was the historical foundation. And very, very inspiring. And we have to go back to that. So thank you for your question.
C'era anche il signore che voleva fare una domanda.
Great to see another magnificent Aussie lady talking about human rights in Locarno. We had the wonderful Mrs. Gilmore.
Yes.
5 years ago, she was out of the world, technically speaking. 3 quick questions. Question number 1, you mentioned the prerogative, I would say, of the agency to urge countries to extend rights to migrants. How urgent do they feel the situation is? This is obviously a non-binding recommendation. Question number 2, picking up from the wonderful question about Palestinians, can you technically be considered a refugee in a country where you were born? Question number 3, an estimated 1 billion people live in Africa these days. There are potentially 200 million people who may try to move north. Migration always go north these days. My country, Italy, and several other countries keep paying Niger, Ethiopia, Mali to try to stop the flow, and obviously it does not work. What do you think history books will say 100 years from now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those great questions. I think that 100 years from now we will have a much greater understanding of the principles on which humanity is going to survive on this planet. I hope we'll be much advanced on where we are today. I don't think we will allow countries to go into themselves and protect only themselves and risk contamination or fail to support. I hope that we'll be much further down the track of the inspiration, talking of the development of international law, the Global Compact on Refugees, where countries have agreed that they will share equitably the responsibilities for refugees. That is our strategic vision. That's where we want to go, but we're not there yet. I think that we are working towards a greater understanding of that responsibility for refugees, but we're a long way from it. But I've noticed that in your question you were speaking not about refugees so much as migrants. And migrants are not refugees.
That's why I'm saying, how urgent can it be? That was my question. If you have only a prerogative of urgency, you can urge country to act,
Yes.
but they don't obviously feel any type of bind in your urgency. What is your prediction about this? Because the people who are coming are not going to be refugees, are going to be migrants.
Well, the global movement of peoples is much higher than any number I've cited. In other words, people are saying, we may not be a refugee, we're not fleeing from violence or persecution or discrimination, but we're fleeing from inequality, poverty, particularly gender inequality, sexual exploitation, lack of opportunity. That is where, in fact, that is why most people are leaving, the root causes. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the UN Refugee Agency is work with the World Banks, with the investment bodies, to invest in Africa, to invest in Central America, to improve the conditions of life so that you can stabilize populations. Because clearly we can't have a continuing environment in which millions and millions of people are moving to have the advantages that we want everybody to have. The only solution is to stabilize populations where they are. And of course, the truth is that most people in Africa stay in Africa. Of course, there will always be movements north, as you say, but they're relatively small numbers. They're in the tens of thousands. But the movement of peoples are in the hundreds of millions, the scores of millions. And the challenge is to, and it's an urgent challenge, is to invest in countries to enable people to live more equal lives and give them better opportunities. So we've solved a lot of these problems in the Western world, where we have access to education, healthcare, and opportunity. But we haven't solved that for much of the rest of the world. And that's the urgency that we all have to acknowledge, that we have to share that responsibility to work with these poor countries. I know, of course, that Europe has been very generous in providing funds for Africa, but a great deal more is needed, I'm afraid. I know that's frustrating from a political point of view, but we need to put billions and then trillions into parts of the world to achieve the level of protection that we all need. We've got a long way to go, but I'll stop there if I may. I won't answer all your questions now. Yeah.
Benvenuti in Locarno, the first city in Switzerland with an apartheid policy.
Okay.
The last one was, can you be technically considered a refugee in a country where you were born?
Well, I think that if you are fleeing, can you be a refugee in the country that? Yes. You would not be a refugee in relation to your own government, but you would be an internally displaced person, and you have rights under the international legal system, and we are responsible for those people. So they're not technically refugees because they haven't crossed a boundary, but they are nonetheless. They do have legal rights, and it's part of our mandate within the UN.
It's an interesting question, of course. Are there others? Please. Yes.
Yeah, hello, my name is Gerhard Lob. I have a question for Ms. Triggs, and picking up also the issue of Palestine. In 2018, our Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs has made a travel to the Middle East. Coming back, he declared that the UN Agency of Aid to Palestinian People, UN, the name is UNWR, is not resolving problems there, but is part of the problem for Palestine people. Do you agree with this agreement? I suppose not. What do you think about it? And did you ever speak on this topic with Foreign Minister Swiss Ignacio Cassis?
I haven't spoken to that foreign minister. I've recently returned from Jordan, where, of course, UNRWA works. And of course protects the interests of Palestinians. We don't. They're represented by UNRWA. As a UN body, we are always subject to scrutiny and to accountability, and we will always be criticised because we can never do enough. We take that responsibility very seriously. We want to be scrutinised. We want to meet the highest possible standards, but we don't always make it. We don't always meet those standards, and we're not always able to provide the care that we want to provide. Do I agree with the statement that we're part of the problem? I don't agree with that statement, but as you would expect, possibly. But I think that having met our colleagues who work for the Palestinian refugees, I know that they're doing absolutely everything that they can to protect them. But I'm afraid this is a problem not of humanitarian protection, but it's a problem of politics. And until we solve these issues politically, it's very hard for the UN agencies to be as effective as they're capable of being. So I think we have to work on this. Of course, we accept criticism, and we try to meet that criticism. But I think to say that we are a causal part of the problem is rather unfair. But I will look more closely at this, but it is not actually within my mandate or within UNHCR's mandate. But I'll look at your question and see where we can go with it. It's an important one too because we rely so much on Switzerland as our champion, as our supporter, and we need to know what they think. And in fact, if I may say so, the ambassador from Switzerland to the UN system in Geneva has spent the last couple of days with us. So now I know him, I will ask him the very question you've asked. So I'll take it back to Geneva. Thank you.
Microfono a Paola. Prego.
I mean, I'm a spokesperson of the Foreign Affairs, and Switzerland is generously funding UNRWA for helping Palestinians.
You know the topic.
He was asking himself if you can maybe think and see the problem from another perspective. But until we don't have a political solution, Switzerland decided to still finance UNRWA and go on financing UNRWA and working with them together.
Bene.
Thank you.
Le precisazioni. Signora?
Aspetti,
Sì, with translation.
Magari ho la voce abbastanza forte, vabbè. Mi chiamo Francesca Machado. Allora, lei ha raccontato la storia della bambina di 12 anni del Sud Sudan e allora mi è venuto in mente i minori non accompagnati, che sono molti, e la sua storia in fondo è andata contro la Convenzione internazionale sull'infanzia, sui diritti dell'infanzia, perché la bambina aveva il diritto di studiare. Ecco, in questo caso anche voi cosa potete fare come agenzia per difendere e proteggere i minori? Collaborate anche con chi fa parte della Convenzione dei diritti sull'infanzia? Perché ci sono tanti problemi con i minori non accompagnati che contrastano con i loro diritti, e questo anche in Svizzera. What do you do? What you can do about
That's right. Well, thank you, Francesca, for your question. And it reminds me of something that I meant to say earlier, and that is that about 50% of the people we protect among refugees are children. So although we use the language of refugees and we use the language of internally displaced people or stateless people, I regret using that language sometimes because the people we're talking about are children. And in some countries, the children are a significant majority. They're 58, 57%. It's truly shocking. And in a way, I think your point is a key one. It's children we're dealing with. What can we do? Some countries, of course, have been extremely generous with unaccompanied minors, and you'll know that coming from Greece, many countries of Europe have agreed to take those unaccompanied children that have been coming across. And that we've, of course, been very, very pleased to see. But as a lawyer, of course, I understand your question. We have one of the most widely accepted conventions in the world, the Convention for Children. And it is unfortunately disregarded by some countries. And children are detained in poor conditions. They are denied access to education, and they are denied their absolutely fundamental rights that came, of course, from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's very worrying to see this. Now, what can we do? Well, at UNHCR, we are advocates. We speak to governments. We speak to ministers. We try to do quiet diplomacy because, as you know, quiet diplomacy is often the most effective. But there are times when we have to speak out. So we speak to the media. We speak to bigger groups like this. But it can be difficult because sometimes if we speak out too strongly, my colleagues will be declared persona non grata. They lose their visas and they have to leave the country. In some countries, and I won't mention them, but in some countries, if we speak up about their policies to refugees, to children, we will be forced to leave the country. Now, we have to play this practical game. We have to be pragmatic. It's more important for us to be in the country, doing what we can, than being excluded from the country. And the plight of these children is often raised. Of course, it's important that people respond to children. And so it's an important part of our advocacy that we do talk about children. That's why I talked about that 12-year-old girl. but even so, some countries say, well, they've come across with their families, their parents are to blame, their parents are wrong, and we will detain them for months and sometimes years. It's very hard to do anything about it. Now, I won't get too technical, but you can bring actions in your own courts, especially countries that have charters of human rights. But it's also possible to appeal to the United Nations Human Rights Committee or to the committee that takes complaints in relation to children. And we do that. And we provide legal advice, and we intervene as amicus curiae. We intervene in cases to protect children. So we do what we can, but we can't always be successful. But thank you for your question, because it really puts the spotlight on the thing that is most distressing, really, to see.
Some other questions from the public?
There's a gentleman there.
Il signore, sì, prego.
Okay, so I prefer to do the question in Italian because I want to be very specific, if you don't mind. Thank you, Ms. Triggs. Ok, allora la mia prima domanda è, visto che siamo a Locarno, io sono un produttore cinematografico, è appunto qual è il ruolo dei media per la prevenzione? Ok, quindi una domanda generica. La seconda invece è appunto, noi stiamo facendo un programma per un altro genere di rifugiati che sono di grandissima attualità. In questo momento tutto il mondo, in varie zone, in varie aree, vede molti boschi e molti incendi boschivi e tantissime persone sono costrette ad evacuare le case e le zone, quindi l'Australia, la California, varie zone dell'Europa. E noi abbiamo fatto una campagna, vorremmo fare un programma charity, infatti vorremmo tanto presentarglielo, che si chiama Fire Prevention World, e uno dei testimonial è Michael Madsen, che nel 2018 diciamo, ha perso la sua casa a Malibu, ma insieme a lui tantissime altre persone note e meno note hanno perso la casa. Ora, il problema degli incendi boschivi è qualcosa di drammatica attualità, perché è molto connesso con il cambiamento climatico. Se prima il fuoco si propagava solo nella direzione del vento, adesso si propaga come una stella, perché è una sorta di cancro, perché l'atmosfera riconosce l'anidride carbonica come amica più dell'ossigeno. Ora, non voglio annoiarvi con questo, volevo solamente sapere come mai un programma come il nostro fa fatica ad essere conosciuto sui media, e io mi sento rispondere continuamente che non è un problema diciamo, di cui dover parlare, perché ci sono cose più importanti di cui parlare. Ecco, allora volevo capire cosa stiamo aspettando prima di poter magari avere lo giusto spazio per parlare di questo genere di rifugiati, perché sono tante centinaia di migliaia di persone. Grazie.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed, and nice to see a filmmaker picking up on these issues. The first question, as I said earlier, the media, the movie industry, films, photographs, advocacy of that kind is more powerful than anything, and that's why filmmakers are so critical, because they can tell the story in a way that that has an impact. And you'll all remember the Al Gore movie on climate. I mean, that had an enormous political impact, and it's still being shown. Of course, it's tragic that the message he was delivering then is still an issue, and we'll be dealing with it for many decades to come. I think that on climate change, we will see more displacement of people because of climate change. Fire is one, but of course floods and storms and rising sea levels are others. But I think the work that you're doing in trying to give prominence to this is very, very important. The loss of land and habitat species as a consequence of fire is something we've not really understood. But I think even these last few days, where we've seen the fires in Greece, the fires in California.
Turkey, yes.
Also, of course, but Australia's very used to fires, unfortunately.
Sicily, everywhere.
Sicily.
Yes.
I think the fact that it's not, in the past you could say, oh, well, it's a fire in Australia, you expect fires in Australia. But now we have fires everywhere. And so I think people are now much more aware of it. So your film and your work will, I think, be very influential, because it's a more recent phenomenon that we're understanding fire. And we have to, it's about education and about advocacy, but you can do it more effectively than can a lawyer like me. So thank you. We'll work together.
Communicate together.
We'll work together. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Perhaps we should.
Altre domande da parte del pubblico? Ce ne sono state molte, tutte molto
Thank you.
interessanti. Isn't it very interesting questions from the public today? So I think, se è tutto, thank you very much, Mrs. Triggs.
Thank you very much.
For your competence and kindness.
Lovely.
So really,
Thank you
it
very
was a
much.
pleasure.
Wonderful. Good.